Good morning, everyone. Today we are talking about the Chesapeake and Greater Virginia, and I'm going to cover some items that may not have been covered in depth earlier. So I'll try to make this brief, or as brief as possible today. Um, there are some keywords that we should probably be familiar with. I'd like for you to have a sense of all of these. I will also put these on the Canvas unit page. Before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about physical geography. We're talking about the Chesapeake Tidewater area, sometimes referred to as the Virginia Tidewater region. And this is the area that was settled by the English prior to 1700. That's our focus running into the second midterm exam. We're going to look at the development of the Eastern Seaboard to about 1700. So up to that point in the area around the Chesapeake Bay, of course, the James River was the very first area settled by the English. Jamestown being on a neck of land in a peninsula into the James River, which is itself an estuary. Prior to 1700, there really wasn't much settlement beyond the coastal plain. And so on this map, what I'd like for you to get from it, I'll zoom in a little bit for you. That area around the Chesapeake Bay, which is outside of the green area, is pretty much the area that we're talking about. Either side of the Chesapeake Bay, so that would include Maryland and Virginia for the most part. The present day state of Delaware at this time was still in that sort of questionable zone. It would be later basically attached to Pennsylvania, and then it would become its own colony later. But we're going to just focus on this area right about here. Now, this map is a physical geography map that shows some of the physiographic regions, and this green area bordering the wide area is referred to as the Piedmont. So let me back up here where we were. The Piedmont Plateau, as it's referred to, is a rolling land that's basically the foothills of the Appalachians. And the Appalachians proper are composed of the highest areas of the Appalachians here in orange, and then behind the highest areas of the Appalachians, you have a region known as the Ridge and Valley section, which is a very important area to later settlement, as we'll talk about after the second midterm exam. And of course, behind that, we have other areas such as the plateau known generally as the Cumberland Plateau, or depending on where you are, the Allegheny Plateau in Pennsylvania. So the Cumberland Plateau is basically the southern part of it. Anyway, the coastal plain is divided between, there's a fairly distinctive physiographic dividing line between the coastal plain and the Piedmont, and that's referred to as the fall line. So this orange or red line that I've drawn in here is indicative of the boundary line between the Piedmont and the coastal plain. And it's really significant because it is it's a barrier to upstream movement. Most of the early settlements, of course, are moving upstream, the estuaries and the tributaries that are flowing out of the Appalachians into the Atlantic. And really there aren't a lot of waterfalls, but what you do encounter is a series of cascades, sort of what we call in geography an escarpment, geology or geography. And an escarpment is just an abrupt change in elevation on the ground. And so that abrupt change usually gives way to exposed bedrock. And the change is abrupt enough so that there are usually cascades or maybe even rapids in the streams. Well, that's important because trade and commerce, very, very important. Um, Trade and commerce are very, very reliant, especially at this time, on water transportation. So the tidewater area is at an elevation that's low enough that the inlets, the necks of the estuary of the Chesapeake Bay and other bays like the Albemarle Sound and the Pamlico Sound down here in North Carolina, the land is low enough that the tidal changes day to day will cause brackish water to wash upstream, and then as the tide recedes, the fresh water takes over. So the plantations were typically along those tributaries so that they could they had direct access to the ocean and direct access to England by way of the ocean. And if they weren't on the coast, they were very close. So they were within an easy transportation. Now, the fall line then created a barrier to transportation. And what often arose was settlements became established along the fall line at the junction of the fall line and streams. And those towns, those few towns that develop, are generally referred to as fall line towns or fall line cities. So that's just something to keep in mind. We'll talk a little bit more about fall line cities as the region develops. One thing that you should keep in mind is that the Chesapeake, Virginia Tidewater area is a region that will be peculiar all the way into and throughout the 18th century, in that it did not develop much of a central place pattern. And that is, it did not develop many towns. The only towns that you'll find will be those along the coast, like Norfolk and the other cities that are practically on the coast, like Baltimore up here, which is actually on the fall line and the coast. A few other towns like Richmond and Falmouth and a few others would develop along the fall line. St. Mary's City in Maryland would become important. Annapolis, Maryland would become important, but those are coastal cities. So just keeping that in mind, the reason that you didn't have a lot of urban development in the Tidewater area is largely because of the plantation economy, the dominance of the plantation economy. There really wasn't much of a need for agricultural service centers to develop because the plantations were essentially taking care of that function. So let's look at the political geography of Virginia during the 17th century. This is a map of essentially the English colonies of North America between about 1607 with the initial colonization of Jamestown and about 1690. 1690 is about the time that African slave imports began in earnest. So most of the 17th century was a time when you had, there were a few slaves, but many of the slaves were in the northern colonies, in fact, like New York. But most of the slave imports would begin after about 1690. So up until that time, we have a situation where there are settlements of planters, the upper class aristocratic English planters, and they were, of course, in the minority. And then there were two other classes of people, mostly people who we might call free whites of modest means. That is, they were essentially laborers, maybe craftsmen who made the crossing across the Atlantic to establish themselves in some of these early plantation areas. And then the other The third class of people, generally referred to as the servants or the indentured servants. Many of the free whites, or many of the whites who were not of the planter class, who were not of the aristocracy, were indentured servants. So indentured servitude was kind of a way of leaving and sort of getting a fresh start in some ways. Many of these indentured servants were debtors and were taken out of debtors' prisons and brought to the New World at the expense of some of the planters. And we'll cover as why that was the case. But essentially, you have the migration of lots of English men into the region. There were some women, but Virginia early on was had a sex ratio in which men were much more numerous. Let's talk about the native peoples. And in this part of the world, in the Tidewater area here, this is maybe a better map of the Tidewater that would establish itself by 1700. It was, in a religious sense, it was a very secular region, dominated by the Anglicans, dominated by people who were more affiliated with the Church of England. But we can't say that, it would be a mistake to say that the planter class and the settlers in Virginia were even close to being as religiously cognizant, or they were not nearly as religious as people in New England. And for that matter, they weren't as religious as the folks in who would be streaming into Pennsylvania during the early 1700s. So the Anglican Church was predominant. There were very few Puritans here, very few Quakers, but generally they were not there for religious purposes. Now, there were a few earlier religious dissenters like the Huguenots who had established themselves at a few different points in the Carolinas and in Florida, but they were not that significant until a little bit later in South Carolina. We'll talk about them another day. So you have the planter class, the free whites of modest means, the servant class, indentured servants, and then later, mostly in the latter part of the 17th century, the introduction of black slaves. And I say black slaves rather than African slaves because most of the earlier slaves brought into the Tidewater area were actually brought in from the British Caribbean islands, the British Sugar Islands. And so they had been there for a few generations. In fact, the so we might better call them an Afro-Caribbean people. They had not necessarily been born in Africa, but perhaps mostly born on the islands like Jamaica or any of the other islands colonized by the British, such as Barbados. In fact, there are quite a few Barbadian planters brought their slaves directly from Barbados into both the Tidewater and more so into South Carolina, as we'll talk about later. So the primary activities, as you probably know, in the Tidewater area was the production of tobacco during the 17th century. Tobacco was not immediately tried, and we know that the earliest few years of the Jamestown colony were incredibly difficult, with most of the settlers dying and having to undergo or having to experience horrible um, um, conditions, disease, Indian attacks, um, and we could probably imagine all sorts of psychological issues, but mostly famine. And they were starving to death. Many of them starved. Some of them resorted um, to cannibalism. So I'll provide you with something on that to read. But it was John Rolfe, the Englishman that everybody who is under the age of 30 know very well through Walt Disney and Pocahontas. John Rolfe was significant in that he was successful in getting a variety of Caribbean tobacco that was marketable established in Virginia. And it's sometimes referred to as Cuban tobacco or Orinoco tobacco. But the important thing was it was not the North American indigenous tobacco. The Indians smoked their own stuff, but it was not quite as sweet, not as palatable to European tastes, and therefore it was not a marketable product until John Rolfe brought in the tobacco from the Spanish islands of the Caribbean. Another important industry or an important economic activity in the Tidewater was land speculation, essentially surveying land and dealing in the sale of land. And this would, of course, bring trouble with the native peoples. We'll look at some of that shortly. The types of settlement, it was mostly rural settlement, focused on the plantations. The plantations themselves were producing tobacco, but they were also producing foodstuffs because they had to feed themselves. So the plantation settlements were self-sufficient, and they were also engaged in a lot of clearing of land, clearing of trees. So there was a lot of labor needed by the plantations, and those plantations then were hindered by a demand for labor. Land was virtually free to the planter class, but they needed labor. Labor was always very, very expensive. And this was a complete change from the old country. In England, land was expensive and labor was cheap. Not so in the colonies. It was just reversed. So that provided opportunities for the aristocracy, for the second sons who didn't inherit estates. They could go to the New World and claim land for practically nothing. And then all they needed to do was come up with a way to bring labor in. And since there were plenty of people in England who would strive to have their own land, there was no possibility of them getting land, and labor was not very valuable in England. They found that their labor was in more demand in the colonies. So the idea was that they could either sell their labor for a period of years to a planter, and then perhaps become a free man and carve out their own farms. Or if they were already free but they weren't in debt, they might find that they had promising opportunities as skilled laborers, as craftsmen in the New World. So there were a lot of push and pull factors at work in the Tidewater. So the plantations were the basic unit of settlement, and then for the free whites of modest means, they were basically farming small farms, subsistence farms. And this would also be the case for those who work their way out of indentured servitude. And then the other minor facet of settlement, the other type of settlement, would be what we would call the courthouses. And I don't say really courthouse towns or anything like that, because the courthouses were typically rural courthouses, but they had to exist because there were places where land titles and that sort of thing were kept, and it's where court was held. So they were important political points, but generally didn't attract a lot of settlement. So you'll maybe run into that term, rural courthouses, or such and such courthouse, which can often just be a very, very small hamlet and far from anywhere. Native peoples in the Tidewater area, and in Virginia and Maryland and this area we're referring to, the native populations had, like so many others, been greatly reduced by disease before English settlement. There were obviously there were some tribes. In fact, there was a confederacy known as the Powhatan Confederacy. You're probably familiar with that. The Powhatan tribes, and there were dozens of them that were associated with this confederacy, consisted of a few thousand, maybe as many as 16,000, something like that. And this is just right around the Tidewater region. A number of different groups that claimed land and claimed homelands along the Tidewater. But they were basically an Algonquian peoples, that is, they spoke Algonquian languages, and most of them spoke a lingua franca that allowed them to communicate with each other, because they actually allied with one another and were fairly formidable until the English numbers increased beyond about several thousand. So early on, of course, the English colonists were at the mercy of the Indians, and suffered drastically when the Indians retaliated or attacked. One of the worst examples being in 1622, when a surprise attack killed over 500 colonists, and 500 was a very large proportion of the total. So this began, what I guess we could say is that while Indian-white relations in New England weren't the greatest, and Indian-white relations in the middle colonies were okay, we can probably say that the worst conflict between American Indian peoples and early settlers was in the Chesapeake area, particularly in Virginia. So this is where we begin to see serious animosity between the English settlers and the native peoples. It's where we begin to see the development of attitudes in which Indians should be segregated from the white population. They should be removed. So we begin to see an Indian frontier in Virginia, unlike we see any other part of the colonies. We also see the beginning of Indian reservations, because by 1700 there were a number of small areas that had been designated as Indian reserves, in fact, and that was due to various tribes signing treaties that promised the English crown that, they wouldn't wage war against the colonists. One of the more interesting facets of that is that while United States Indian relations, I'm talking about after independence, United States Indian relations would often involve treaties and the establishment of, if not reservations, areas that were recognized by the government for Indians to retain. It was often the case that the United States offered presents and gifts and basically payment to the tribes. At this time, however, one of the more interesting things, at least to me, is that the Indian tribes who signed treaties with the English crown or with the Virginia Company and later the English crown, rather than the crown paying the Indians were required to pay tribute to the crown. So every year, the tribes had to provide so many furs and maybe deer meat to the British in order to maintain peace. I just found that to be kind of curiously interesting. These other groups, there were other groups beyond the Blue Ridge Mountains, beyond the Appalachians, and also in the Piedmont. At this time, before 1700, the Piedmont of Virginia and North Carolina was largely controlled by the Cherokees and a few other groups. It was during you might notice in this map, you'll see in between about the mid 1700s, early to mid 1700s, there was a migration of people known as the Tuscarora, who migrated north to join the Iroquois Confederacy. And the Tuscarora, like the Cherokees and the Iroquois Confederacy, were Iroquoian speakers. They were spoken Iroquoian language. Culturally, they were similar to the Five Nations up in New York. But one of the main reason they left was because of the pressure that the Cherokees put on them. Other groups like the Catawba were forced out by the Cherokees in South Carolina. So what I'm trying to say is that the Indian groups who were located east of the Appalachians were not only pressured to relocate by the English settlers, but also they were systematically harassed by the more powerful, larger groups to the west, notably the Cherokees and somewhat less so the Muskogee Creeks, who were farther south in Georgia. Now, if you're familiar with American Indians in Oklahoma, you're familiar with the Osage Nation, you've probably heard of the term headright. And the term headright refers to shares of the petroleum assets of the Osage Reservation that were divided up and distributed as sort of stock. But that's a term that you're probably familiar with if you're from Oklahoma, or at least if you're from north central Oklahoma. However, the term headright was important during the 17th century in Virginia, and I want you to understand what this means. A headright was a way for the aristocracy to attract labor. Remember, labor was scarce and labor was expensive in Virginia and Maryland, and so the planter class had to come up with ways to attract laborers from England to come to the New World. Now that was pretty difficult when people were dying of all sorts of new diseases and being being hit by Indian raids, and so the conditions were not ideal. It was not like going to the Caribbean. It was difficult, and so One of the ways that this was done was through something referred to as a headright. And for if a planter was to pay for the transportation of an indentured servant from England to Virginia, then that planter would then gain 50 acres per settler. So if the planter sponsored 10 indentured servants to come to Virginia and then basically purchase the labor of those indentured servants, they were willing to invest in those indentured servants, then that planter would have the right to claim another 500 acres. So 10 indentured servants, about 500 acres. So that was an incentive for the planter class to import labor. It was fairly successful, and it was a way for the Virginia aristocracy to gain labor, but also to gain land. And that would be an important facet of Virginia settlement. So let's talk a little bit more about Virginia and maybe recall, sort of refresh our memory about how the English arrived into the region that we're referring to. I'll try to fix this so you can see it a little bit better. There. Well, remember how the English got involved with the New World in the first place. They became somewhat involved in the middle part of the 16th century under Queen Elizabeth I, as Elizabeth began to sponsor pirates or privateers to attack the Spanish gold shipments coming out of Veracruz. People like Sir Walter Raleigh and Francis Drake, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, were important privateers. They were some of the earliest mariners, British mariners, to explore the Atlantic coast. There were a few attempts at colonization by both the English and the Huguenots, and we've talked a little bit about the Lost Colony, and which over 100 English colonists were unfortunately lost because of the politics of the war back in England, 1588, and so anyway, that was an unsuccessful attempt. The Virginia Company of London and the Virginia Company of Plymouth were the two companies that were sponsoring colonization. And I think I've mentioned Richard Hakluyt. That's Hakluyt. It's a sort of a Dutch name, but he was an English geographer, and he had this idea that latitude was basically analogous, or climate was based on latitude, and latitude of Virginia was about the same latitude as southern Spain and Italy, southern France, about the same latitude as Oklahoma, frankly. And because it shared the same latitude, he assumed that you could produce Mediterranean crops in Virginia, which of course we know is way off. Virginia has no sort of climate like the Mediterranean does. That would be more like California. So Virginia is not California, and Virginia is not southern Spain. So they attempted to grow olives. They attempted to plant olive groves and vineyards and citrus groves, and none of that worked in Virginia. The Spanish were able to plant citrus in Florida, and of course they were definitely successful at establishing a wine industry in California, but the English didn't pull it off in Virginia. Now, another one of the ideas that Hakluyt had was, in addition to the agricultural crops, literally believed that Virginia would serve as a what we might call a population pressure relief valve for England, because England was experiencing these sort of the beginnings of population, not really population pressure, but it was becoming embroiled in sectarian disputes that, of course, would later become the English Civil Wars during the middle part of the 17th century. So his idea was that, you know, the groups who were marginalized could always go to the New World and you know, basically find freedom and get out of England, so they would no longer cause trouble for the English, so that, you know, at least for the Anglicans. So that was another possible reason for English settlement in Virginia. The Virginia Company also had regulations. It had ideas, or had a plan. This is important. The Virginia Company sort of had some foresight about what they wanted in Virginia, and so they, like many organizations, came up with fairly elaborate plans about what would be done. And so some of those included the establishment of towns. And so they told the settlers that you need to establish urban centers, and in those urban centers we need to have some skilled craftsmen. We need to have these, you know, different services available. And also, in addition to growing a cash crop, if they could ever find one, they wanted to have some sort of diversification. So they wanted to be able to grow food and be self-sufficient, as well as produce some kind of staple crop. Staple crop meaning a cash crop. As we've said earlier, John Rolfe was the one who was really credited with bringing in tobacco in 1614, getting tobacco established, and developing a market back in England for American tobacco, Virginia tobacco. All right, so just a few notes there for you. We've talked a little bit about the Indian frontiers, and one of there were a number of attacks and sort of awful events that took place prior to 1650. I'll let you read about one in which I think there were around 17 or 19 Englishmen killed in a desperate attempt by the English to get food from the local Indians in just a few years after Jamestown was established. But the worst and the most brutal and organized attack by the Indians in an attempt to, really the first coordinated attempt to completely annihilate the English and wipe them out and stop them at the Atlantic, happened in 1622, and that's when the Powhatan Confederacy launched basically a setup, a surprise attack by inviting the English to inviting the English into their homes and to feast, and all at once the Indians attacked them and killed over 500. That was in 1644. So 1644 was kind of a turning point, and when that occurred, the crown stepped in and started moving more and more Englishmen in to establish what we would later call blockhouses, basically these military points to enforce a boundary line between the Indian country and the English territory. So this is, Virginia is the place where we begin to see the emergence of an English-Indian boundary for the first time. And that would be elaborated with another boundary in 1763 that we will talk about toward the end of the course. A few other things about Virginia was, if you're probably familiar with the University of Virginia, their mascot is the Cavaliers, right? So Virginia Cavaliers. Now the Cavaliers were those who were loyal to the king. And so we can say a few things that I've typed here. You can remember these. Virginia was the colony most closely allied with the Loyalist forces during the English Civil Wars of the mid-1600s. They were definitely not on the side of the Roundheads and the Puritans like the folks up in New England were. So they were very culturally different. People like David Hackett Fischer would attribute that perhaps to regional migration sources, but I'm not so sure about that. Keep in mind that most of the clashes that took place between the Indians and the whites prior to 1700 were mostly clashes between the free whites who were living in the backcountry or living toward the backcountry on their individual farmsteads with their families. Those were the people who began to organize into what they referred to as militia groups. So the early white settlers of modest means began to form militia groups to protect themselves against Indian attack. And so the militia would become an important institution among not just the Virginians, but throughout the southern colonies. The militias were basically the vigilantes and the enforcers of law within the southern colonies. Well, I've talked a little bit about the social organization within Virginia, and we might be able to say that, there's kind of a bifurcation of society along class lines. There was the planter class, the aristocracy, the landed class, if you will, and then there was the servant class and the free whites. The free whites who were of modest means, and the indentured servants who came over. A lot of the indentured servants, were bound to provide labor for the planter class for a number of years, but they had an idea that once they bought their freedom, they had the opportunity to get land of their own. So this is really important, especially in terms of Southern culture. The whites of the lower classes typically had allegiance and respect for the planter class, and this would be important. There are historians who will discuss Bacon's Rebellion and the role of Bacon's Rebellion in that. The Bacon's Rebellion being a sort of a revolt, a class-based revolt in in the time prior to African slaves coming in. So that's maybe up for interpretation, but certainly there was a cultural association or a cultural diffusion of an old English tradition, particularly Southern English tradition of loyalty to the Lord, loyalty to the local aristocracy, respect for that local the local aristocracy, the local family who owned the land, and not just a loyalty, but a loyalty with the sense that one could work his way up into that planter class with hard work. So here lies one of the roots of an American ideal that one can, through hard labor and through honest effort, increase his stature in society, at least materially. And that's one thing that did attract people to the New World, that possibility of working their way into a higher level in society. I've mentioned the headright system already, that there were 50 acres allocated to each planter for each man who was transported. A few other notes here on the term the Old Dominion refers to the fact that that Virginia and the Tidewater families and the free whites of the Tidewater tended to be loyal to the crown during the English Civil Wars, rather than the folks who were the parliamentarians. So again, they were nominally Anglican. That is, they weren't very religious. They did recognize the traditional sort of paternalistic families and kinship system of southeastern England. They were interested in land and getting land and developing their own wealth and their own legacy. Now, the plantation. It's important to know that a plantation was not, in what we refer to as a plantation, probably wasn't of the same type of thing that we are familiar with from the movies, from Gone with the Wind, that sort of thing. Plantations were working landscapes. They were areas where land was where timber was being felled, where fields were being plowed and fields were being left fallow. There was lots of work to be done on plantations all the time. And so labor was always something that was needed. And after a time, during the mid 1600s, after the 1660s, after the English Civil Wars, we begin to see something interesting, and that is that the economy in England begins to improve. More and more people are doing better in England during the latter part of the 17th century. And because of that, there are fewer people in debt, and there are fewer people needing to escape poverty in England. And with that comes a problem in Virginia, with no way to attract laborers, new laborers, and with those who have been contracted being freed because they worked their indentured servitude off. Labor became even more expensive. And because labor became more expensive, the plantation owners were already reliant on more and more labor. They began to look to alternative sources. And of course, that source was African slavery. Slavery had been practiced for more than a century by the Spanish, particularly the Spanish and the Portuguese in the Caribbean, as well as the Canary Islands and the Madeira Islands, the Azores. The Sugar Islands of the Caribbean were the model for the English, and not just the Spanish and the Dutch, but I mean Spanish and the Portuguese, but also the Dutch were engaged in black African slavery. So the English adopted that system, purchasing slaves typically from the Dutch, and eventually some of the English got involved in the slave trade as well. Initially, the first African slaves, like I said, came from the Caribbean islands, but then later more from the Gambia in West Africa and Angola in Southern Africa. So most of the slave imports had a specific source region in Africa, mostly West Africa. Well, I think I'll continue with this on Friday, tomorrow. So we're going to have one extended lecture tomorrow, and I will look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.